This family seemed like a real-life version of the American dream. But just like many stories we've shared before, looks can be deceiving. It all began like a normal night, a quiet home, a mother tucking her daughter into bed, and nothing out of the ordinary, at least on the surface. But by morning, that same home would become a crime scene. The woman and her 7-year-old daughter, both found brutally murdered. And by brutally, we mean this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was rage, evil intent. There were no signs of forced entry, no screams heard in the night, just silence and blood. The city of Palmerston North, small, safe, the kind of place where doors are left unlocked, was shaken to its core. Who could have done this? And why target an innocent family? Pretty soon, suspicion started to swirl. A late-night trip, a shirt with a strange stain, a computer turned off at a very specific time. And suddenly, the story everyone thought they knew started to twist. Because in this case, the monster might have been closer than anyone imagined. This is the story of the Lundy murders, and it's going to stay with you. Before everything fell apart, they were just your average family, Mark, Christine, and their daughter Amber, a tight-knit trio living in Palmerston North. Mark and Christine had been married for 17 years, and Amber, well, she was their whole world, their only child, bright, bubbly, and loved by Mom and Dad. They ran a business together, selling kitchen sinks. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills most of the time. Behind the scenes, though, things weren't quite as stable as they seemed. The company was constantly in debt, often owing their supplier close to $100,000, and instead of pulling back, Mark went overboard. In 1999, he made a bold move. He bought 2 plots of land in Hawke's Bay to grow grapes. Dreaming of a vineyard, maybe. A fresh start. But dreams like that don't come cheap. The landowners later testified that Mark missed multiple settlement dates. Penalties started piling up, interest rates climbing as high as 14%. By August of 2000, the Lundys were drowning in debt, owing nearly $140,000 in penalty interest alone. And the final payment deadline was 30th August, the exact day Christine and Amber were found dead. Now, just 5 days before the murders, the couple had signed papers to increase their life insurance from $200,000 to $500,000. Christine's signature is still fresh on the page, but the new policy hadn't been processed yet. The insurance rep, Bruce Parson, made that clear. The increase wasn't active. Still, Christine was dead before the paperwork went through. After the murders, Tower Insurance did cover $75,000 of the Lundy mortgage, but there was no big payout. No $500,000 check, just grief and suspicion. From the outside, it looked like a family chasing big dreams. But underneath, the cracks were already forming. Before we dig into those cracks, let's take a step back to Tuesday, August 29, 2000. It was a chilly, uneventful day in Palmerston North, the kind of day most people would forget. But by the next morning, that quiet little town would never be the same again. That morning, Mark Lundy climbed into his car and hit the road for Wellington. It was just another business trip for him. Selling kitchen sinks and fittings was his everyday grind, and these work travels were nothing new. Sometimes he'd be gone overnight, sometimes just for the day. Nothing about that Tuesday raised any red flags. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, Mark checked into the Foreshore Motor Lodge in Petone, a peaceful suburb in Lower Hutt. The receptionist saw nothing unusual. He got his room key, settled in, and from the outside, it looked like everything was normal. He had an alibi, and apparently no reason to head back home. Just 30 minutes later at 5:30, his cell phone rang. It was a call from home, either Christine, his wife, or their daughter Amber. They chatted for about 8 minutes. Mark later told police that one of them mentioned they were going to grab dinner at McDonald's. That detail checked out. Police later found a McDonald's receipt in the Lundy home, time-stamped at 5:45 that evening. It was solid proof that Christine and Amber were alive at that time, an ordinary moment frozen in grease-stained paper. But things slowly began to shift. At around 7 o'clock, Christine answered a phone call from a friend. She sounded normal. No panic, no strange tone, no hint that anything was wrong. Whatever horror was about to unfold in that house hadn't happened just yet. Meanwhile, back in Petone, Mark kept going about his evening. At 8:28, he made a phone call to a business associate to talk about an investment in a vineyard project in Hawke's Bay. But back in Palmerston North, something sinister was creeping in. The last sign of life in the Lundy home came at 10:52 that night, when the family computer was manually shut down. Not unplugged or crashed, properly turned off by someone. That simple action raised alarm bells. Some believed it marked the moment when the killer finished what they had come to do. Later that night, at 11:30, Mark made another call, but this time not to a business partner. He contacted an escort service in Petone. A woman was sent to his motel and reportedly left around 1 in the morning. This detail would later become a cornerstone of his alibi. How could a man be involved in a brutal double murder in another city while hosting a visitor at his motel room? But it wasn't the escort's visit that would flip this story upside down. It was what happened the next day. On Wednesday, August 30th, sometime mid-morning, Christine's brother, Glenn Weggery, came by the house. He had a business matter to discuss with her, but when he knocked on the front door, no one answered. He walked around the back and noticed the ranch slider door was unlocked. As he walked inside, he found Christine's lifeless body on the bed, covered with blood. She had been struck in the head multiple times, so violently that fragments of bone and brain had splattered the walls. In the doorway of her bedroom, Amber was found face down on the floor, still in her nightgown. She hadn't made it far. Like her mother, she too had been attacked, with the same level of brutal force. The killer showed no mercy. This wasn't just murder, it was rage. Police rushed to the scene and immediately knew something was off. A back window looked like it had been tampered with, maybe to stage a fake break-in. But there was blood on the frame, and it belonged to Christine. It felt like the killer had tried to make it look like someone had broken in, but only after the killings were done. The scene was both vicious and calculated. At first, it looked like a robbery. A small jewelry box was missing, which led investigators to wonder if someone had broken in for valuables. But nothing else of value was touched. Why take only a trinket box and leave everything else behind? This wasn't a random act. It felt personal. The injuries were so extreme, detectives believed the weapon was something like a tomahawk, small, sharp, easy to swing, and just as easy to get rid of. That led to the biggest question of all. Who would do this? Who had a reason, the opportunity, and the time? That's when the focus turned to Mark Lundy. Police believed he was responsible. But here's the twist. Depending on which version of the case you follow, they couldn't even agree on when it supposedly happened. In one version of events, Mark left his motel after the business calls, drove more than 150 kilometers back to Palmerston North, killed his wife and daughter, then sped back to Petone without anyone noticing he was gone. Another theory sent even more chills down spines. According to that version, the murders didn't happen during the evening hours. Instead, they claimed Mark Lundy snuck away from his motel sometime after midnight, right in the tiny window between making a call to an escort service and the woman arriving at his room. That gave him less than 1 hour to drive all the way back to Palmerston North, brutally murder his wife and daughter, clean himself up, and return to the motel like nothing had happened. Think about that. Less than 60 minutes to cover over 300 kilometers, commit a savage double homicide, and get back without a trace of blood, guilt, or evidence. No one saw him on the road. No traffic cameras caught a glimpse of his car. No petrol receipts, no roadside witnesses, no motel staff noticed him leave. And yet somehow, police believed he had made that drive, not just once, but twice, all in a single night. A disappearing act worthy of fiction, except it was being treated as fact. Then came the moment that would divide a nation, not in the courtroom, but at the gravesite. They say grief hits everyone differently. Some people shut down, some collapse, and some wailed in the sky. But when Mark Lundy buried his wife and his only daughter, his grief didn't just spill out, it exploded in front of cameras. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't subtle, it was broadcast. Just days after Christine and Amber were found slain in their home, a funeral was held. The church overflowed with mourners. The entire town felt broken. 2 innocent lives had been ripped away in the most violent way imaginable, and there were still no arrests. People came to grieve, to remember, to find peace. And then Mark Lundy arrived. Staggering between friends, he could barely stay upright. Cameras rolled as he sobbed uncontrollably, his face contorted in agony. His cries echoed. He shook violently, collapsed to the floor, and had to be held up by those around him. It was the kind of grief most people hope they'll never experience. But for others watching, it was too much. Something about it didn't sit right, and slowly, something dangerous began to grow. That display of grief, which should have been a private moment of mourning, became a public referendum on guilt. Was he crying too much? Was it real? Or was it a performance hiding something darker? Years later, in 2018, even the Court of Appeal acknowledged the impact of that scene. They believed jurors were likely exposed to repeated broadcasts of Mark's funeral breakdown during his trial. It could have been in the courtroom on a nearby screen, or maybe during lunch breaks while the news blared in the background. Either way, the image stuck. Jonathan Eaton, QC, Mark's own defense lawyer, didn't sugarcoat it. He said the footage made Lundy look pathetic, almost comedic. The man seen flailing and wailing at his family's funeral had become more than just a grieving husband. He had become a suspect, trapped in the spotlight of public doubt. Whether it was intentional or not, the public spectacle of that day planted a seed of doubt. And in a case already plagued by blurred timelines and elusive evidence, that seed may have grown into something fatal. Because in the court of public opinion, grief that looks too big can sometimes feel like a lie. From the moment investigators stepped into the Lundy home, it was clear this wasn't a simple break-in gone wrong. There were no signs of a struggle downstairs, just silence. And then, upstairs, an explosion of brutality. Blood everywhere, bone fragments. A child's body crumpled in a doorway. A woman bludgeoned so viciously, her skull shattered. For weeks, police searched for a motive, a suspect, a weapon, anything that would make sense of what happened that night. And then, a breakthrough, or at least, that's what it looked like. Inside Mark Lundy's car, police found a polo shirt tucked away in a zipped-up tool bag. It was stained, too small to notice at a glance, but enough to raise suspicions. The shirt was sent off for testing. At first, they found nothing conclusive. But then came the second round of testing, and that changed everything. A laboratory in Texas, yes, Texas, examined the shirt and came back with a shocking claim. The stains contained central nervous system tissue, human brain or spinal cord matter. According to the Crown, it was Christine's. Specifically, her brain tissue had somehow ended up on her husband's shirt. It was the kind of detail that doesn't just suggest guilt, it screams it. Who, after all, gets their spouse's brain matter on their clothing by accident? The prosecution's story sharpened like a blade. They said Lundy had driven all the way from Petone to Palmerston North late that night, silently entered the home, and hit his wife and daughter to death. Then he drove back, cleaned himself up, and called an escort to solidify his alibi. They claimed he stuffed the shirt in the car afterward, stained with the very evidence that would betray him. But here's where things unravel. The science behind the testing, called mRNA analysis, was cutting edge, controversial, and according to some, unreliable. It had never been used in a criminal trial before. Not in New Zealand, not anywhere. Experts clashed in court. One side insisted the brain tissue was unmistakable and damning. The others said the results were riddled with flaws, prone to contamination, and should have never been admitted as evidence. Even the timeline didn't sit right. The prosecution had originally claimed Lundy committed the murders around 7 p.m., but then the evidence didn't line up. The phone records, the McDonald's receipt, the call to the escort, all of it suggested he was nowhere near Palmerston North at that time. So they changed the theory. Now they claimed the murders happened closer to midnight, that he made the 3-hour drive in a disguise using extreme speed under cover of darkness in a window of time barely wide enough for everything he allegedly did. All this just to get back to his motel before sunrise, with no blood in his car, no witnesses, and no physical weapon ever recovered. The defense tore it apart. They said the timeline was absurd, the evidence questionable, and the science untested. But by then, the image had been planted, a man with his wife's brain on his shirt, a husband, a father, or a monster. During the retrial, the prosecution changed their story. Now the murders had to happen after 10:52 p.m., a theory they previously argued was impossible. It looked desperate. The defense hammered the inconsistency, calling it trial by timeline gymnastics. Because if Lundy couldn't have made that journey, if he couldn't be in two places at once, then everything else collapsed. Still, the Crown insisted the science overruled the clock. The shirt had brain tissue. The motive was debt. The means were rage. The timeline? They said it was just tight, not impossible. But for many watching the case unfold, that wasn't just a stretch. It was a canyon leap. Because this wasn't just a question of, could he do it? It became a question of, is it even possible? A second trial. That's what Mark Lundy faced in 2015. Nearly 15 years after his initial conviction, a revised case was built, complete with fresh legal arguments, expert testimonies, and an entire reworking of the timeline that had once betrayed him. The first trial had sent him to prison for life. But after the Court of Appeal ruled in 2013 that his conviction was unsafe due to a combination of controversial science, an inconsistent timeline, and media influence, the case was reopened. So Lundy found himself back in the dock, this time with new evidence, new questions, and a new chance to argue his innocence. But was it really a fresh start? The key pieces of evidence were the same. Brain tissue on Lundy's shirt, the financial motive, and the suspicious timeline. The defense was still going to fight the credibility of the forensic evidence. They had to. But what about the motive? The timeline? Could they build a case strong enough to counteract the years of speculation, media frenzy, and courtroom drama? The prosecution stuck with the brain tissue theory, arguing that it could only have come from Christine's head. But the defense wasn't having it. They tore apart the validity of the forensic findings, calling the mRNA analysis an experimental science. They questioned whether the analysis truly proved anything about the tissue, particularly when it came from a contaminated sample. Then came the timeline. The prosecution's case still hinged on the idea that Lundy could have driven from Petone to Palmerston North, killed his wife and daughter, and returned to Petone, all in the dead of night, within a time frame that defied basic logic. But this time, the defense argued it wasn't just a stretch, it was impossible. They called into question every single assumption the prosecution had made. But what about the motive? The defense wanted to know why Lundy would kill his wife and daughter just days after increasing their life insurance payout. Sure, the prosecution said it was all about the debt, but it didn't add up. Why murder your family when there were easier ways out? Why would the debt-ridden businessman go to such lengths when the insurance policy hadn't even gone into effect yet? And let's not forget the media circus. By the time of the retrial, Mark Lundy's face was etched into the public consciousness. The funeral footage had already been played to the point of it nauseating the viewer, and the perception of him as a grief-stricken father who might be faking it still haunted the jury. His dramatic outburst at the funeral had been analyzed endlessly. Too much grief, they said. Was it genuine? Or was it all just an act? As the defense painted Lundy as a victim of circumstance, it felt like a battle of facts versus perception. On one side, the prosecution clung to the scientific evidence, even if it was controversial. On the other, the defense tried to poke holes in every single assumption, from the forensic evidence to the timeline to the motive, all while painting a picture of a man who had been wrongfully accused. But in the end, after all the arguments, expert testimony, and battles over science, the jury's decision would come down to one question. Was Mark Lundy truly guilty of 2 brutal murders, or had the system failed him? The retrial would conclude in Mark Lundy's conviction once again, guilty of murdering his wife Christine and daughter Amber. The timeline discrepancies, the questionable forensic science, and the shattered public perception weren't enough to save him this time. The battle for truth, however, wasn't over. Lundy's lawyers promised an appeal, but it would be years before the final resolution. In the hours following the brutal murders of Christine and Amber Lundy, the first person to arrive at the crime scene wasn't a detective or a police officer. It was Paul Peterson, Christine's brother. And in the chilling silence of that moment, everything about his presence seemed off-kilter, as though fate had placed him in the center of a storm that would rattle the very foundations of his family's world. It started as any other day in the sleepy town of Palmerston North. But for Paul, the day would be branded in his memory for reasons that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It began strangely enough with a phone call from his sister. Christine had promised him that they would discuss a family matter. But when Paul arrived at the Lundy home to meet with her, something felt wrong. The front door was ajar, and a sense of foreboding washed over him as he stepped inside. Then he found them. Christine and Amber Lundy, their lives violently stolen from them. For Paul, the discovery was a moment frozen in time, one that could never be undone. As he entered that crime scene, there was no going back. He had walked into a nightmare, one that would unravel the very fabric of his family's life. But what stood out most was the eerie sense of calm that seemed to surround him. When Paul Peterson found the bodies, he did what anyone would do. He immediately called the police. But as investigators began to piece together the timeline, something didn't add up. Paul had been the first to arrive at the house and had discovered the bodies. The question loomed. Could Paul have been involved in the murders? Was his cool demeanor in the aftermath a sign of guilt, or was he simply a man consumed by the horror of what he had just found? The police quickly realized that there was an unsettling pattern emerging. Paul had not only been the first to discover the bodies, but his actions and testimony were pivotal in shaping the narrative of the crime. But there was something unnerving about how he recounted his discovery. The images of Paul calmly entering the house, speaking to officers, and later testifying at trial were captured, and each time they replayed his somber tone, a cloud of suspicion hung over him. The more the investigation progressed, the more the spotlight fell on Paul Peterson. As Mark Lundy was arrested and charged with the murders of his wife and daughter, Paul Peterson remained in the shadows almost as a ghost, the silent witness to it all. But what many didn't realize was that Paul, in his own grief, was beginning to attract his own set of questions. Had Paul been too calm in the aftermath? His measured reaction to finding the bodies and his cold recounting of the crime scene was later scrutinized by those who wondered if this was the reaction of someone who had committed the murders. Was his calm demeanor a defense mechanism, or was it something more sinister? Could it be that Paul Peterson knew more than he let on about the deaths of his sister and niece? Though Paul was never formally charged or implicated in the crime, the suspicion around him never truly disappeared. People in the community couldn't help but wonder if he had been too close to the crime, and some began to question if the investigation had missed something important, perhaps a detail in Paul's testimony, or an action he had taken before calling the police. In the end, despite the lingering suspicions, Paul Peterson was never charged with the murders of his sister and niece. The investigation moved on to focus heavily on Mark Lundy, and Paul returned to the periphery of the case. After years of legal proceedings, Mark Lundy was acquitted in 2019 after the Court of Appeal found that the case against him had been fundamentally flawed. The court ruled that there was insufficient evidence to support his conviction, and the brain tissue evidence, which had been one of the most critical pieces of the prosecution's case, was deemed unreliable. The timeline presented in the trial was also deemed to be full of gaps and inconsistencies that cast doubt on the original conviction. The retrial had exposed significant weaknesses in the case, and with the new evidence pointing toward reasonable doubt, the Court of Appeal concluded that the conviction was unsafe. As a result, Lundy was acquitted of all charges. The case may have reached its legal conclusion, but one thing is certain: the truth remains elusive, just out of reach. Could the killer still be walking among us, hidden in plain sight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.